do see a long-term ownership position, and I see it bringing great stability to that part of the Middle East and maybe the entire Middle East.
Morning glory and evening grace, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt in Studio West. May I have 10 minutes of your time and have you listen closely to an appeal for humility? Because in the 12 hours since President Trump made that statement about the United States in Gaza, I've seen 100 takes, I've heard dozens, and none of them come with context or humility. Now, I know a little bit about land use law. I spent 27 years advising the largest landowners in Southern California and Nevada, one project in Palau, on the front end, land use permitting, development agreements, federal agency, state, local agency permitting, that kind of stuff. So I know a little bit about development. Don't know anything about actually building the buildings, but about entitlement. I know almost nothing about Gaza that I haven't read. I've never been there. I've only been to Israel twice. But I began this monologue by doing just some basic research about how big is Gaza. We know there are 2 million Gazans, right? Roughly 2 million Gazans. In context, there are 112 million Egyptians. There are about 11 million Jordanians, 2 million Gazans. There are more Palestinians in Judea and Samaria. That's the population context. How about the size of Gaza? I want to put it into context for you. Gaza is 90,000 acres. I want to use a frame of reference. Most Americans understand what an acre of land is. They know they're on a quarter acre of land if they have a house, or a half acre of land. An acre. Gaza is 90,000 acres. In context, Disney World, all of Disney World, is 25,000 acres. The Woodlands development in Texas is 28,000 acres. The Villages in Central Florida is 35,000 acres. And Gaza is 90,000 acres. And you say, well, that's 3 times bigger than the largest master plan community we've ever done. No, not really. Because the Irvine Ranch, which is still being developed in Southern California, spans a couple of cities, Newport Beach and Irvine, and maybe further south. It's over 90,000. It's closer to 100,000 acres. Now, that's a lot of land, and none of it happens quickly. Every master plan community, MPC, takes 10 years minimum to get started, permitted, and building. And what the president is talking about there, Gaza 2050, whatever the plan in his mind is, he's been thinking about it a lot, because I've talked with him at least twice about it. Most recently on October 7th of last year, we talked about Gaza, and in a I've talked to him more on the air than I think any other broadcast journalist has. I've only had like one private meeting with him and a half dozen private conversations, but I do most of my interviewing of the president on air. And when we've talked about it, he's always talked about it in the terms that he did yesterday. It's a beautiful piece of land that is in rubble, in ruins. Now, Trump does know development. He knows a lot more about development than just development in Manhattan. He's developed in the Palos Verdes Peninsula in California. He's developed in Florida. He's developed around the world. He has Trump names on buildings in which he has an ownership stake in Chicago and in Nevada. I don't know what his ownership interest is, but ownership interest is not necessarily a real estate term of art. It's an accordion term. It can be a term of art. I'm going to take X% of this project, or I'm going to handle that. Sometimes land developers entitle, and builders come in and take the entitled land and build on it. So it's not unusual to get a big land use development project with a dozen different builders building their best product that they have researched for that market. So I don't know what he has in mind. I know that he is used to developing, and I know development takes a long time. Another example, when I trundle in Northern Virginia, I will sometimes park at Gravelly Point, which is a parking lot sort of between Memorial Bridge and Reagan Airport. And you can run towards Memorial Bridge and onto the mall from there, or you can run from Gravelly Point towards Mount Vernon as long as you want. When you go towards Mount Vernon, which I'll call roughly south, although some people say it's east, seems south to me, I've been running past or trundling past for almost 10 years now, the redevelopment of a corner of Old Town Alexandria where an old pumping station was, and where there's a very complicated redevelopment of that pumping station that took forever to dismantle, probably because it was very old and who knows what was in it. And they're dealing with water, and they're dealing with Clean Water Act, all sorts of issues. I don't think they're endangered species there, but Alexandria has a play in that. The state of Virginia has a play in that. The District of Columbia has a play in that. And the federal government has a play in that. So it's a complicated project. I never expected it to go up overnight, but it is taking forever. And they're working on it all the time. So that's a maybe 3-acre development. Now we're talking about 90,000 acres. Basically, I think what Trump has in mind is what George Washington had in mind when he hired L'Enfant to design the federal city. And if you've ever seen the room where it happened, the musical Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton walk into a room, and Hamilton comes out with the National Bank, and Jefferson and Madison come out with a commitment that the federal city will be built on the banks of the Potomac. And George Washington took that agreement, and he hired a Frenchman, Pierre L'Enfant, who was really kind of mercurial, but genius. And he designed the beauty that is Washington, D.C. And over the years, it's evolved into parts that are beautiful and parts that are not. They've had incredible, quick evolutions when World War II came. David Brinkley, the late David Brinkley, wrote a book when Washington went to war about everything that they built on the mall because it was the only place to build stuff. And now it took forever to get it down. Then we had riots in 1967 in Washington, D.C., or 1968, I can't remember. And a lot of the city burned down, and a lot of this. But then there's a lot of gentrification. Now there's a lot of degentrification. Urban environments are complex, and it's best if you can begin with a blank slab like the Irvine Ranch Company did, the Irvine Company, when they got the 100,000 plus Irvine Ranch, which was made up of 3 adjacent Mexican land grants that came into United States possession after the Mexican-American War. Now, that's just the land use side. What about the 2 million Gazans? Well, first of all, there are hostages in the tunnels. There are terrorists in the tunnels and above ground. Everything is booby-trapped, and the war has not been won. When the Marshall Plan was launched by George Marshall at Harvard, when he announced it at commencement, Germany was in rubble, lots of Europe was in rubble, but the Nazis were defeated. The terrorists here are not defeated. They have been deeply wounded, but they are not defeated. Douglas Murray wrote about this in the New York Post yesterday. You really can't begin the peace until the victory is secure. But it could be done. It could be done either if the Palestinians reject Hamas en masse, which is unlikely. If you listen to my interview with Haviv Rettig-Gur yesterday, which is at my YouTube channel, he'll explain to you the deep dysfunction in the Palestinian understanding of history. And it's very unlikely, unless we lean on Egypt and Jordan, that they'll take a proportionate share. So 112 million Egyptians, they would take 1.8 million of the Gazans and give them purple passports or something that says, in 3 years you can go back to Gaza, and in the meantime we got a redevelopment and demo the subway that's not a subway but a terrorist infrastructure. Jordan has 11 million people. Could they take 200, 300,000 Gazans for a few years? Perhaps. They might go back and you would clear it, and you would begin to lay out a plan, and you would stub up the infrastructure, and you would do everything that developers do. And it's wildly optimistic to think that can be done. But I know what I don't know. I don't know what Trump is thinking. Nobody does. And the same thing was said on countless newscasts, podcasts, and in op-eds about the tariffs. We don't know what Donald Trump is thinking or what his strategy is. And it is arrogant to say, oh, he's crazy, he's a lunatic. It's actually bad journalism. It's a poker tell that you've got Trump derangement syndrome, or long TDS at least, and that if you've promised to actually objectively cover Trump now, because he won so overwhelmingly, you've slipped off the wagon. If you had TDS and you're a recovering TDSer, you got to shake that off. I wrote about that for Fox News tomorrow morning. All I want, just some humility, please, about development, about Gaza, about Trump, about Bibi. We don't know what they're thinking or where they're going. All I know is that the first time I ever brought up Gaza, Yoni called me and said, "You don't ever want to go there. It's the worst place on earth." And I'll never forget that call. That's 20 plus years ago. And I'm here to tell you, I don't know and you don't know, and nobody who's opining on this knows. They just know what they think about Trump, and they're infusing their commentary about Gaza and Trump they're infusing their belief about Trump into their commentary about Trump and Gaza, and that's wrong. It's not journalism. It's hysteria. I'll be right back. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Part 2 of my conversation with you about humility and Donald Trump and Gaza. And if you're just tuning in, I want to set the stage again. Our TriCaster froze, so we couldn't use our beautiful pictures, big, beautiful pictures. Gaza is 90,000 acres. Right? That's how big it is. Disney World, by contrast, is 25,000 acres. Right? That's pretty big. A lot of Americans have a sense of how big Disney World is. The Woodlands development in Texas is 28,000 acres. So it's bigger than Disney World. But the Villages, where the old folks live in Central Florida, that's 35,000 acres. So Gaza is 3 times the size of the Villages. And you say, well, that's just undoable. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. The Irvine Ranch, when they started developing it, was 100,000 plus acres. And it was the combination of 3 Mexican land grants. And the Irvine Company went through a couple of ownerships. It's now owned by Donald Bren. He's done a magnificent job on building it. He put a university on it, University of California, Irvine. He put Fashion Island on it. It's just an amazing part of Southern California. And I think it was Mobil owned it first and then Brenda, but it takes a long time. There are master plan communities all over the United States. Can Gaza be a master plan community? Not with Hamas. Absolutely not with Hamas. Now, Donald Trump has been thinking about Gaza a long time. I want to go back to my program in October when I interviewed then candidate President Trump, and Gaza came up, cut number 5. Mr. President, you're a developer, so I want to talk to you about Gaza. I worked with land use developers for 35 years when I was actively practicing law. You know how to build things. Gaza is in ruins. Could Gaza be Monaco if it was rebuilt the right way? Could someone make Gaza into something that all the Palestinian people would be proud of, would want to live in, would benefit them?
It could be better than Monaco. It has the best location in the Middle East, the best water, the best everything. It is the best. I've said it for years. When I've been there, and it's rough. It's a rough place before all of the attacks and before back and forth, what's happened over the last couple of years. And I said, wow, look at this. I mean, they'd have the back of a plant facing the ocean. They'd have there was no ocean as far as that was concerned. They never took advantage of it. As a developer, it could be the most beautiful place. The weather, the water, the whole thing, the climate. It could be so beautiful. It could be the best thing in the Middle East, but it could be one of the best places in the world. And, there are other civilizations. I don't know if you know this. It's crazy, but that's been a rough neighborhood. That's been a rough place. Underneath that are 2 other civilizations where they were wiped out and they started over and they build on top. It's amazing. I mean,
do you think your
partners? That's been a very contentious area for a long time. I can tell you that.
Can you get the Abraham Accords going again and get your partners like UAE, Bahrain, and possibly Saudi to help you, and Egypt to help you in Gaza if you're president again, to rebuild it the right way and get rid of the fanatics?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, I think not only the Abraham Accords, the Abraham Accords is one of the great things that's ever happened in the Middle East. That should be loaded up with everybody right now. And, I made the statement the other day. People said, I would have gotten, in my opinion, 50-50 chance, maybe more than that. Iran would have been in the Abraham Accords. They wanted to make a deal so bad until
then we were off and talking about Iran. I want you to know, we have talked about Gaza before that. He's been thinking about, he's a land guy. Of course he's thinking about the land in the Mediterranean. Yesterday he does a joint press conference with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he says cut number 3.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it. and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site, level the site and get rid of the destroyed buildings, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area. Do a real job, do something different. Just can't go back. If you go back, it's going to end up the same way it has for 100 years.
All right. That's true. More than 100 years. Napoleon committed an atrocity. Napoleon ordered the execution of prisoners in Gaza 210 years ago. So it's not like it's going to change anytime soon. I don't know how many civilizations have been there. I heard John Podhoretz on the Commentary podcast say that was the home of the Philistines. I don't know. All I know is that I have humility about what can be done, except as to the fact that you can't rebuild with terrorists in place. I'm not humble about that. That is a fact. And Douglas Murray wrote about it yesterday.